Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Parenting Problems Today. And today is myself, Robert Trout, your host, with Paula Arredondo. We are both parent trainers with parenttrainers.com. And this episode today is something that comes up a lot and in every age group that we serve, from tweens to teens to young adults. And it's something that parents have very often showed up with the frustration of this should be so simple. So today we're going to talk about the reality of school refusal. And what we really want to touch on today is kind of the basics of understanding school refusal. Some of this might seem like common sense, but very often what we find in our work is that in the family dynamic or in the container of the family, the parent is very often thrust into this place of stress, not even from my kids not going to school, or they are laying in bed and refusing to go to school, or whatever that might be. But very often, and as a parent, I relate to this, is the stress of the school's gonna be mad at me as a parent. We all dread those phone calls, those letters in the mail, the threat of legal action at times, depending on the school system that you're a part of, just because truancy is taken extremely seriously. And what's very often missed in that is that school refusal within a family system, we're not just talking about the kid not getting out of bed. We're also talking about the parental stress of that situation and how these two things that are separate interact with each other. So today we're going to talk about the basics of school refusal and just have an open conversation about what that means. And we'll probably go through each age group because it is a little different as you move through the expansion of what kids are doing and why they're doing it. So as we get started, let me jump in and talk about the reality that school refusal most commonly shows up as a progressive action, meaning that it's not sudden. Now, of course, there are the outliers. There are the outliers that are like one day they just don't want to go to school anymore. And those outliers very often are really found to be in the trauma center of identifying what's going on for a kid. So very often something happened in their life, either at home or at school or somewhere in between, but something has shocked their system. So the outliers are very commonly found in the something bigger is going on here. And yes, there is school refusal, and we need to slow way down for a sudden ontake. That's much bigger case of assessment, in my opinion. And I think, Paul, you're shaking your head. You would agree with that. That sudden behavioral change is one of the big red flags or the indicators when we do assessment work with families as to, okay, something has occurred that is dramatic and very highly impactful upon this person's behavioral patterns. So very often that's going to go to trauma, okay? But let's back up into what I was saying, that most circumstances, it's not that. Statistically, what we see, and I think other professionals and coaches see, is that school refusal is one of those things where it just kind of happens every now and then. And it really depends on what's going on for the kid. And today's the basics of school refusal. So let's just talk about some of the things that start to happen. The pattern is usually indicative of, oh, I'm so tired. I don't want to go to school today. Can I have a mental health day? Or I don't want to go to school. I can't handle it right now. Or just all these language things that we pick up on when we go backwards, right? We do a history with a family. Very often this is what we're hearing, or statements of, I'm just so tired. I need to rest. I need a mental health day. And that usually comes because a lot of school systems actually offer that now as recognition that sometimes kids are reaching a place of anxiety that they do actually need a day to reset and recenter. Now, the intent of that is that they take a day and that's it. But then we move into the pattern where when parents start to pick it apart, then, that was this week we missed one day of school. And then the next week they missed another day of school. And then sometimes it'll even skip 2 weeks where it's like, oh, everything's fine. Like there's really no big flashing red light when we talk about the basics of school refusal. What we are seeing is the reality of, okay, I recognize that I needed a day. I took a day. My parents let me take a day. The school let me take a day, maybe, etc., whatever it might be. But then we start to see the pattern progressively become a little more and a little more over time. In my experience, and Paul, I'll ask you about this, in my experience, families can recognize a pattern of usually 3 to 6 months of developing this pattern, where by the end of the pattern, what we're headed to is just flat out laying in bed, refusing to get out of bed at times, or getting up and leaving the house, but not going to school. Okay. And we can look at the spectrum, the ends of that, but we're really seeing school refusal as a system of avoidance of the situation or the home, or sorry, of the school, or some piece of it coming in. Most commonly, parents show up with the story of my kid just won't get out of bed. They're refusing to get out of bed till noon, 1 p.m., whatever it might be. And we'll look at that in a second. But I usually see it as a 3 to 6 months pattern until the parents are fully recognizing that, oh, this is a problem. Before that, it was an inconvenience. It was frustrating. It was a lot of things. But parents start to label it at a problem somewhere between 3 to 6 months for me. Do you agree with that, or what do you think, Paul?
I think that there's so many factors in why school refusal could and does happen that the time change, that distinction of 3 to 6 months can, I mean, I'm glad that you gave it a big old width of,
Oh yeah.
variability there, because I think it does actually depend on what the child is actually challenged with, right? Because
Yes.
you said a little earlier, like anxiety, like social anxiety or performance anxiety, or being capable of showing up and attentive in the classroom because maybe they have some challenge, like a learning challenge, like ADD, ADHD, or dyslexia, or something of the sort. So the other side of it is, of course, the social issues, right? Creating that
Yeah.
space to recognize how we're living in a very unique time. These kids are growing up in a way that we didn't live. Being able to understand the social pressures and how things like technology impact those dynamics, and creating space for the conversation with your child. And
Yeah.
so this is the conversation we're having right now is just to raise your antenna a little bit, create some space for you to develop your own awareness and think about what does it mean to stay connected to your child. Like, what sort of questions do you want to ask, and how do you generate a dialogue of what's happening? Because as you said, Rob, we see a progression. And so to be dismissive of the comment, I don't want to go to school today, and just take it as a one-off, I think you might be setting yourself up for some more frustration. So,
Yeah.
curious about what's going on for them, and not so much digging in and putting them under the interrogation lamp, so to speak, but
Yeah. Yeah, don't do that.
yeah, for them to feel safe enough to talk about it.
Yep.
Right? So oftentimes,
So
slowing down with them.
yeah, in our work, what I want the listener right now to really realize, for our work, we start really engaging with parents that are raising tweens, teens. That's the beginning point that we're seeing this. And one of the first things that always comes up in that discussion is your child is starting to not be a child anymore. We're seeing rapid progression at times of neurological development, puberty, change in hormones and process, things like that. So very often parents need to back up and say, "Oh, the trap as a parent is this is simple. Go to school."
Hmm.
And I hate to tell you this, it's not that simple. And very often, if what we're seeing or not seeing is the development of an anxiety disorder, having that interrogation lamp that you're talking about, that metaphor, come in from the parents. So now they have the anxiety of school and relationships and process performance and et cetera at school. Now we have the parent on the other side not holding space for the, this is really hard for me,
Hmm.
right? So we start to see that anxiety. And the truth is that when we see that collapse into an anxiety disorder, it is most common to see that partnered with a depressive disorder starting to kind of bud itself out of like, I guess I'm not good enough there or here,
Hmm.
right? Like there's no place for me. I'm not strong enough, whatever it might be. There's so much tied into education and self-esteem of how good of a student they are or how many friends they have or just so many ors there, right? Like so many things can trigger this effect for each individual kid.
Yeah, and you use the word collapse. And I think
Yeah.
that that's a very appropriate word. And when you see collapse, that means they've gone through a journey. Because most kids can, be resilient in the face of stress until it becomes so overwhelming that they can't process it anymore, that they're not capable of being in the face of it and working through it, using some skills, even if it's just their own internalized resilience and capacity, or it's actually skills that they've been taught, like take some deep breaths, do the things you need to do to like settle yourself and move forward. So recognizing again collapse, that means they have done a ton of efforting to the point of exhaustion to try and work themselves through a process. And in that exhaustion and in that sense of helpless hopelessness, like there is yeah, the just settling into stillness that is about, trying to do some self-care. And in fact, it is actually a very like a what's the word, decompensatory, like that place of really just struggling to show up.
Yes.
So yeah, people when they're in collapse, they're actually at the end of their rope. And
Yeah.
so watch out for jumping and pouncing on them because that's not going to support them in feeling safe and talking about their experience.
And that doesn't mean, as parents, if you're listening to this episode, that doesn't mean that a little pressure is not healthy.
Right.
Like, yeah, you're the parent. You're setting the boundaries and the pace and the structure of learning how to handle life and problem solving and etc. What we're trying to get out there for everyone that's listening to this is the recognition that your stress in this situation is something that's the like, oh, wait a minute, where is that coming from? And I have to recognize as the adult in this scenario that I don't have to take this stress and add it to the pool of whatever's happening over here for my tween or teen in this process.
Yeah.
So separating those two things, I would say step one of the basics of school refusal is you can't show up with the force of your anxiety and your disappointment and your emotional reaction to this and then expect a result to change if they're in a therapeutic collapse, if they're looking at this like they're just going under the covers, refusing to move, threatening suicidal ideation, like so many things you start to see in this process where they're in an anxiety and depressive loop, or they're just scared. There's more things other than anxiety and depression, right? That cause school refusal. The goal is to recognize that yeah, this is going to be stressful for me, and I want to remain a safe adult. There's the goal. So the step is to separate your emotional reaction. The goal is to remain a safe adult for them to be mentored by and to ask questions of and to remain in that place of, okay, something's going on for me. Now, for me, I also see the mistake. I believe it's a mistake in this scenario where this is where a lot of parents are like, you're going to therapy. And they like throw them in the direction of like, talk to a therapist and that'll fix this. It's not that simple. It's one of those pieces that is your child asking for help. Because if you're forcing someone into a scenario of go here and that will fix you, you've now labeled like, hey, you're a problem and I want this person to fix it. And there's so much evidence, especially in the tween and teen world, that if they're forced into something, the likelihood of them taking it internally to actually try to do a change process, they're actually resistant to it because you forced them into it without them asking for help. So there's also a basics goal here of getting that person to recognize like I as the parent, I am witnessing your struggle and I would like to offer not only what I can do, but what others can do to support you. And that might be therapy, that might be mentorship or friend and peer interaction can also be an amazing tool. And we can do a whole episode on that later. But then we get into bringing other family in or having a system set up at school where the teachers and the counselors there are interacting in a specific way to help your child re-engage and feel like they're welcome or build that safety that they're going to need at school. So many different directions of intervention, but it always begins with the separating your reaction and setting the stage for being the safe adult, and then exploring the possibility of them wanting and desiring a different result or help in a certain direction or whatever that might be. And that's where we're gonna, Paul, you were saying like specific questions. Can you think of a basic question, since this is the basics of school refusal? Where would you start? Like the basic questions.
I mean, some of the most basic are, hey, tell me how you're feeling right now. What's going on for you right now? Is there something happening that you don't want to engage? Are you concerned about a dynamic that you're gonna have to face at school? Are there things that you feel like you're not confident about engaging? Be it a school assignment, be it a social situation, be it, I mean, so it's these general questions. Because when we get almost too specific, it can feel a little pointed, and then they can shut down or pull back more. So oftentimes questions and how we orient to them, especially when somebody's in a tender place, the more broad or the more general, the better.
Yes. Yep. So let's look at this from kind of some developmental stages. When
Mhm.
we talk about tweens, right? So we're seeing sixth, seventh, eighth grade essentially in that dynamic. We start to see school refusal there for the same reasons, usually, that we start to see it in teens, but it's usually that budding puberty and the change neurologically that's happening for them. And
Mhm.
sometimes it's as simple as them recognizing that they're changing, and that's scary, right? At that age. So it's not that something has happened at school. It's not that there was an event necessarily. It's very often is that just okay, things are changing, and that is scary. So you mentioned resilience. For me, when we talk about tweens, very often that's where the interventions or strategies begin. I think for school refusal for tweens is the development of resilience and problem solving, which very often comes into almost like teamwork practices between the parents and the child and peer to peer, like setting the scenario for them to have those play dates and processes that you kind of like set the stage of, hey, you two, can you solve this problem together or accomplish this task together? Or like really just giving them the opportunity to succeed as a tween with peers, with you, and to show them that it's okay to fail and then restart and fail and restart. So, basics of like low ropes courses and team building philosophies is you need to have the opportunity for them to fail and witness the lack of, I'm going to say, emotional reaction from you and others around them. Because very often there's that beginning of anxiety, which very often in tweens really shows up as a fear of being wrong or doing something wrong or
Mhm.
etc. That's usually the first steps. Anything you'd add to that for tweens?
Yeah, tweens is such an interesting stage, right? Because they're really testing out how to individuate from their parents, how to
Yes.
individuate from their family, right? They're trying to claim something outside of their identity with you, mom and dad, and so when it comes to parenting them, there's also, as much as they're creating that shift, and we talk about this in every single podcast and in every single training that we do, it's a broken record. Your parenting style has to change to meet them. And one of the things you said, Rob, is set them up to figure it out for themselves. Because, before they're tweens, we as caregivers, as parents, we do a lot of problem solving. We do a lot of fixing. We do a lot of
For
rest
them.
for them. Exactly. And so pulling back and giving them the opportunity to practice being discerning, practice building skills for themselves, practice trying things, and as you said, Rob, failing. Because this is that time where it's okay for them to fail. It's okay for them to kind of test the waters of peer relationships and dynamics. And I think, the bigger, broader scope of this conversation is, as you said a couple of times now, Rob, like, can the parents or can the caregivers like take a step back and go, ooh, I'm feeling this right now. And
Yes.
can I pull myself back and maybe have some clearer perspective of, oh, this isn't about my kid dying. This isn't about my kid like failing in life. This is a phase. This is a moment. This is a disturbance in their well-being. And can I treat it as such with compassion and patience and care and willingness to actually, again, put your emotions on the back seat and meet your child? Because I think, especially around the tween age, it's that transition from like telling your child who they are to being curious about who they are,
Yes.
right? Like
Yep.
moving into curiosity. This is that stage, and then forever forward, right? Rather than telling them who they need to be curious about who they want to be.
Yep.
So you'll hear us echo again that sense of curiosity being such a valuable tool to have them feel safe.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great segue into teens, because a lot of that is true also for teens. But
Certainly.
when we see the patternings of school refusal for teenagers, usually we're already into the neurological development and patterns of an actual disorder, possibly depression or anxiety or things like that. But very often it doesn't have to be about that, because the teen in the individuation has chosen school as the target of being different. And so we see a lot of dynamics show up for families where school refusal is about control. Not always, but it's a new consideration that they're looking for. What are you going to do? How are you going to make me go to school? Why do I need to go, etc. But we also have to stop and pause, because sometimes that's really centered on a developing pattern where now their brain is very different from when they were younger. So we actually see a lot of, for example, autism level 1 diagnosis. This starts to happen in teenagers because there is a neurological shift that allows for their thinking and problem solving and patterns are within the parameters for such a diagnosis. Things like that, where, okay, maybe they're not just being avoidant. Maybe they're not just fighting. Maybe they really are moving into something that's going to be a part of their life experience as they're growing, developing the skills to individuate, but also problem solving. Teenagers open every door in the sense of, okay, when we do assessment, when a family does an assessment of what they're dealing with, that's how I hear it a lot. This is what we're dealing with. It's like, okay, let's back up. As a teenager, it really is that, okay, everything else might be moot. Everything from before, the perfect little kid they used to be isn't a part of this story. It really isn't. That's what they were. And now this is where we're going. This is what they are today as they're developing and figuring out how to do this. But very often they do not have the emotional language to describe to you their internal or their emotional or intellectual process that's happening for them inside who they are. And very often I find that a tremendous amount of the conflict in the family system is because the parent isn't recognizing that. They think that this teenager should be able to tell them what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's on I'm going to say technology and culture lately. That in my opinion, that's one of the big influences, is we're expecting kids at younger and younger ages to be more and more functional because we have greater tools and technology and things from, quote unquote, when we were kids. So if we can let go of that, there is that, like, okay, there's still teenagers. That hasn't changed. Yes, there's new technology and new expectations and rules and, school processes, etc. Yes, all of that is new. They're still teenagers. That's never changed. And we're witnessing a reality check there that when we're seeing school refusal, every possibility needs to be explored as to what's leading them into it. Thoughts on that?
I think you're spot on when it comes to parents being a bit presumptive about their child's capacity to communicate. I think that we as a culture suck at emotional intelligence. Well, we don't teach it, and I mean, it wasn't taught to our generation. The
Yep.
nuance of language. You can go and just do a Google search on Wheel of Emotions or charts on emotions, and you can see a bunch of faces and recognize then how uncommon it is to actually speak with nuance and specificity around what's happening underneath the surface. You'll hear frustrated and angry and, sad and all those very general senses of what's happening. But and what's also interesting is your teens do have exposure to therapeutic speak, which is why they will say, I need a mental health day. But that doesn't necessarily mean they know why they need a mental health day. They're just
Yep.
feeling a bunch of distress, and they don't even know maybe where to point at in order to understand it. And so helping them have a process and helping them slow down enough. And again, I'm going to say it again, be safe in the conversation. That is the long and the short of it, in order to understand what support can actually look like. Because you're going to be throwing darts in the dark until you ask the right questions. You're going to be making a
Yeah.
ton of assumptions until you sit down with them and truly hear them. Again, that curiosity rather than telling them who they are. So, creating that space for them to feel held and feel safe enough to kind of challenge their own vulnerability. Because again, they don't oftentimes, even if they're really well read and they're going to a good school or they're in honors English, they're still going to struggle to even place labels on their experience. So,
Yes. Yep. And then let's take this conversation back to the basics with teens in the sense of school refusal specifically. There should be a level of awareness. If you're a parent listening to this, there should be a level of awareness that as this pattern has developed over the usually last 3 to 6 months, and now you're seeing it as a problem, that that is a recognition on you, on the parent side, to say something has been changing for this person
mhm.
and I need to resource them. This is not an element of I need to punish you for not going to school. This is not a reactive situation where more stress or pressure is going to be helpful. School refusal, specifically at its basic, is always looked upon in the sense of it's a symptom of something deeper. So if you try to go after this one specific behavior, you're going to miss the underlying process, the internal process that's happening. So resourcing is where this is always going to go for a teenager, of getting them, like, the goal isn't to go to school today. The goal might be, let's get out of this house today. And that might not be with you. You have to go to work. Great. Call the grandparents or the friend or whatever after school. Get out of here. Leave this house and go do something, because action is in direct process of inaction. We just need them to keep living life so that there's momentum, so that if they say, I do need help with this, great, let's go to a counselor, or let's go to the school and work with the teachers, or do after school program instead of during school program, or let's switch to online school for a little while and try that. Like, being open to the possibilities saves so many families so much stress, because you have to find what's going to help them from each stage as they head towards whatever the goal is. But the goal is not, when there's a mental health aspect, let me be clear about this. When there's a mental health aspect, the goal is not you need to go to school every day. The goal is, how do we stabilize so you have the space and capacity to resource and work therapeutically on yourself, and to work and to recognize the anxiety or to the self-harm behavior or the whatever it is. We need to make room for the resourcing and work on this at the same time as meeting your education requirements, whatever that might be. Any
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
I would also include, you mentioned it a little bit there of, it doesn't need to be you to have these conversations. And it doesn't
Yes.
necessarily need to be a therapist.
Nope.
I would question the idea of it being a friend, a
Yeah.
peer, but
This
if
is where peers start to be part of the problem sometimes.
exactly. So even getting them out of the house, it's not cutting them loose to go and hang out with their friends,
No.
right? So I want to be clear on that. You're not like giving them
Yeah.
free
Thank
rein
you.
to go. Yeah. So it is about like helping them be productive or helping them feel like they're generating momentum or, as you said, Rob, movement. And again, that can come from a teacher. It could come from a counselor, of course. It could come from a tutor. It could come from a mentor. It can come from a family member, an uncle. It can come from a coach. It could come from a music instructor. Use your imagination. Really what you're doing, and Robbie used the word resource. You have more resources than maybe you're acknowledging. I really challenge you to kind of sit back and think about that a little bit further and maybe even have that conversation with your child. Who are the adults in your life that you have conversations with? Who are the people that you feel like you can approach if I wasn't around? Like be curious about that too, because it's the idea of planting seeds for them as well. Giving them an opportunity to think about, yeah, who would I resource in that moment, or who would I turn to in that moment? Because that could then like give them, something to reach for in the future. So being able to slow down again, be patient with them, create the space for them, and hold some expectations, right? Because there's as you said earlier, Rob, assessment. Is this willingness, like they are just flat out unwilling to go to school, or is it capacity where they just cannot get out the front door, right? And so that's the difference between like mental health and maybe some behavioral challenges,
Yep.
right? And so, that's part of the assessment. So we've been framing it a lot around like the mental health, right? Around what does it mean to like be curious and assess and create space for, a process and again, be curious about who they are. And even if it is a willingness thing, still be curious about who they are.
Yep.
And show up with them and create the opportunity to help them reorient to what school is and what it isn't and what it can be for them in terms of bigger picture ideas of next steps in life.
Yep. All right. Well, let's move this into the final zone that we work with a lot, which is young adults. And when it comes to school refusal in young adults, what we're really looking at there is that this individual's left home, usually, and gone to college, usually, is where we start to recognize this pattern as school refusal for young adults. And we'll just touch on this today because this is a very complicated question when it comes to young adults, because very often the parent is unaware of it until that kid comes home and says, I failed this whole semester. And they go, what? What? Hold on, back up. What's going on? And the story that usually comes through there is, well, I couldn't go to class. I just couldn't do it. Whether that's getting out of bed or just complete avoidance when we see school refusal as a young adult. What would be your thoughts, Paul, on if we really break it down into these young adults, these college students, they're 18, 19, 20 years old, and we're hearing from the parent, we're not sure what's wrong. What's the first thing you step into when you hear that?
I say, I'm glad you're being curious.
Yes.
Right? Rather than snapping to judgment, right? Or making assumptions about what's actually happening with your child. Continue with the curiosity. That's what I would say. Is what sort of questions have you asked him? What sort of dialogues? Is he or she open to your curiosity? Have you asked about, and this is going back to what we've said previously, how they've resourced, in their environment? Have you talked to them about like have they made or constructed even an intention around school, whether it be scheduling or a plan, and just be curious about their capacity to even articulate that, right? Because ultimately what you're trying to understand is this just a motivation issue? Or is this now I'm on my own and I don't know what to do issue? Is this a undiagnosed ADHD challenge? Is this now
Executive
that I'm out of,
functioning.
yeah, or is this now that I'm out of the house and I don't have anybody monitoring my technology? They are like binging on video games and Netflix?
Yep.
Or is it them diving into social environment, right? What is it that is the barrier to them creating focus for school? That would be where I would start, is be more curious.
Yep. Okay. I'm going to give my basic warnings that I talk to families about in this scenario. Just because this process can grow into something that breaks families. It really does. Where, for example, the parental reaction that I most commonly have to step into is where one or both parents, in whatever the parental situation is, shows up with the "I will save you" mentality. That is trap number one for the basic talk of, like, if you have a young adult, they're not going to class, they're either asking for help or not asking for help. The parental response very commonly, and I think for me and the research I've read very often, is that empty nester, like the parent is having to figure out their new purpose because their kid's gone.
Right.
And then suddenly their kid calls and says, "I'm failing at life," however you want to translate that. The parent response is, "Yay, I get to do something again."
But it shows up
And
as anxiety and like,
yeah, yeah, anxiety. Yeah, there's so many reasons behind this, but just for this conversation, I say to every family, beware of the internal reaction of "I will solve this for you. I will save you. I whatever
fix it.
whatever your emotional response is."
Yep.
That's step one when it comes to young adult is, whoa, hold on. This isn't me, right? Because of all the things, this can't be you. You can't save them.
Hmm.
Don't try to save them. Recenter yourself and say, how can I resource this person externally of myself
Hmm.
where they can still talk to me,
Hmm.
adult to adult conversation, and I can be supportive, but I'm not rescuing. I'm not going to enmesh myself into their success, especially that like success in college. Sometimes that's part of it, is this kid's not ready for college, and the parents actually are the ones that are driving that, like, but that's what you have to do. So there's that conversation as well of, okay, maybe the direction is to back off and resource them to develop job skills and young adult personal skills and internship or a gap year experience. Or there's so many opportunities, but very often the parents have to be the ones to say, "Oh, wait a minute, we have to back off, before we make this situation worse or more complicated," whatever language kind of impacts you for that. I don't like worse, but that's what most families say later on, is "I made it worse, and this is just getting worse and worse." And like, okay, hold on. Let's just say that it got more complicated and there's an enmeshment factor or whatever it might be. But back to the basic, I witnessed you're struggling. I can't save you from this, and that's okay. I can mentor you, offer resources, or if you're asking for help, let's explore what that would be. And then you decide where to start in that help process. Like, there's all these, like, okay, if I'm backed up and they're asking for help, something can happen.
Yeah. What I tell parents in the most simplest of terms is change your language from "how can I help you" to "what support do you think you need?"
Very good.
That
Yes.
simple. Rather than "how can I be your support" or "how can I be that narrow lens of I am the solution," to help them open up to the understanding that they have so many options, especially locally around them if they're on a campus, right?
Yes.
Creating the space for them to be curious about what haven't I resourced. So again, easy shift of language, not "how can I help you?" It's "what support do you need? What do you think would be helpful for you right now?" Right? Create the space for them to broaden that sense and definition. Because if they're calling you and saying, "I don't know how to do this," there might be some pattern of rescuing and problem solving that, you might want to be a more self reflective on and kind of change the story or do differently. So, yeah, watch out for being their adult inner self. You don't want
Yeah.
to do that for them. You don't want to rescue and problem. You want to help them become their own problem solver, their own rescuer. You want to help them build that muscle for themselves as they're going through life.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, I think that is a good stopping point for the basics of school refusal. There really is this, like, okay, pause, remove yourself from the reaction, whatever age group you're in, and then pay attention to the assessment and the pattern of your family system, and then look at the solutions that are there, the resourcing that you can do as parents, understanding that you can't fix this for them, no matter what age they're at. This
Right.
is going to be the beginning of a process that they're asking for help, whether they know it or not, and have the language and capacity to do so. School refusal, very often, again, it's the symptom, that shows up that parents are quick to say, oh, I see the problem. Great. Okay. Well, you see the problem. We see the symptom. And we all need to back up and go into, okay, something needs reworking here.
Right.
So take a breath, ask good questions, and be a safe adult. Don't rescue. And yeah, work with somebody, whether it's us or someone else, to help resource you as a parent as well. Because you're going to need to have a roadmap for yourself of this is where we're at and this is how I need to adjust as I move through it. So thank you for listening. As always, we invite you to join our community at parenttrainers.com and to ask questions, give us podcast episodes, and show up with solutions and processes. And we look forward to doing the next episode for all of you. Thank you.